You might not know a lot about motorcycles. You might not know the difference between inline fours and parallel twins, dual sport bikes and adventure bikes, but you can probably see the irony in the words performance cruiser. I mean, think about it. Performance means things like sharp handling, truckloads of power, and big old brakes. And cruisers are all about laid back, casual riding. It's kind of like wanting to have your cake and eat it too, which doesn't always work out. Luckily, in this case, it does. This is the 2025 Indian 101 Scout. It's one of our favorite motorcycles right now, and today, we're gonna tell you why. There are two ways to look at this 101. The first is as an homage to the original 101 Scout, which was produced between 1928 and 1931 and was at one time referred to as the best motorcycle ever. The second is as a response to the continued rise in popularity of performance cruisers, and more specifically, tall West Coast club-style motorcycles. Now, there's no specific formula for these builds, but in general, what you're gonna get is taller, upgraded suspension, better brakes, bikini fairing, a tall moto-style handlebar, and a bunch of little styling updates throughout. Indian technically has two performance cruisers right now. There's the larger, more raw, air-cooled Sport Chief, and then there's this, which is based on the mid-size liquid-cooled Scout platform. Importantly, that Scout platform was all new this year. It comes with a bigger, more powerful engine with a bunch of upgraded internals, as well as an all-new steel tube front frame. That's important because it's gonna give this bike a visually lighter and more modern look. Plus, Indian says that it was designed to help with overall handling and will make it easier for customizers to custom build Scouts. Another cool thing is that they've updated the tank styling and shape on this bike, which is gonna give it a much more modern and beefy look compared to previous generation models. Technically, there are 4 other Scouts, and they all come with a different combination of wheels, tires, and styling treatments to hit different subcategories. But when we rode all of those bikes together, this was very clearly the best bike of the group. Now that we've had the chance to ride the bike for a few more weeks, we have an even better idea of what it's like to live with this machine. Little bit of a sidebar, you'll notice the DynoJet dyno there in the other room. We run all of our test bikes on that dyno, including this 101 Scout, which made 100 horsepower and 75 pound-feet of torque. Now, it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison because the 101 has a dedicated ECU tune and technically makes more power than the other 2025 Scouts. However, for comparison's sake, the last Scout we had on the dyno made 84 horsepower and 64 pound-feet of torque. So you've got 16 more horsepower and 11 more pound-feet of torque on this bike compared to previous generation Scouts. You might also be wondering about Harley-Davidson's Sportster S, since that's one of these Scout's main rivals. Well, the last Sportster S we had on the dyno made 110 horsepower and 85 pound-feet of torque. So yes, more power all around, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because while Harley-Davidson has tried to make the Sportster S a more modern and polished bike, Indian wants the Scout to have that classic American V-twin cruiser feel, just with a little bit more performance on top. They're really different motorcycles.
Before the ride kicks off, we do want to say that we took the 101 Scout to Cycle World's Proving Grounds, where we test for quarter-mile times, acceleration performance, and braking performance. We'll drop the numbers on the screen so you can see exactly how the 101 performed. Now, what I think is so beautiful about this bike is it gives you exactly what it promises. You have a little bit of that laid-back cruiser feel. I mean, this V-twin engine is lopey. It makes just the right amount of sounds, and then at the same time, you have that added aggression from the suspension and the brakes that just kind of ups the cool factor of the bike and gives you a little bit of that sporty edge that you really want from a bike like this. Speaking of suspension, the big news here is that you have the fully adjustable inverted front fork with 5.9 inches of travel. So that's about 1.2 inches more travel than the suspension on the base model Scouts. Now, I know this is not a review of those Scouts, but it's worth mentioning that we've ridden those bikes, and man, the fork on those bikes is, for lack of a better term, abysmal. And there's just no bump absorption, no compliance, whereas with this fork you have so much better bump absorption. And it's funny because you think, okay, that's going to add so much more to this bike up in the canyons and in that fast-paced riding, but the reality is that it also makes a difference just riding around town. I mean, the overall comfort that you have in that bump compliance is really great on this. Not to mention, you've got the fully adjustable piggyback shocks, which are really cool because, again, you have the adjustment. You can tune them for your weight, for your riding style, all of that. But then at the same time, it's got just a little bit better look to it, right? There's a little bit of a styling element to them that give this bike, the 101, that premium look and feel. Overall, I think it's a nice upgrade for this bike. Are they the absolute best suspension components ever? No, probably not. But for what you're going to do on this bike, man, the added performance that you get from this inverted fork and those shocks is such a nice upgrade. The one thing I will say is that those shocks, they still only have 3 inches of travel, so they're not any taller than what you're going to find on the other bikes, and that basically means that you're not going to have any more cornering clearance on this 101 versus the other Scout models. So yes, you are still going to drag foot pegs every now and again when you're up in the canyons riding a little bit faster. It's a performance cruiser, but it's still got cruiser in the name, and you are going to be touching them foot pegs down every once in a while. Now, as for the brakes, you've got an upgraded front braking package that consists of a dual 320 millimeter disc. So dual disc versus single disc on the other Scouts. That's going to give you a lot more braking performance. But on top of that, you've got Brembo 4-piston calipers. And the big thing here is, again, yes, this is going to give you more power and more feel when you're riding at a decent clip up in the canyons. But one of the things we notice is it even helps just riding around town, like what we're doing here. If you get stuck in traffic, something happens and you got to get to the brake lever really quick, there's a lot more immediate performance, and I don't think anyone's ever going to complain about that, right? It's an upgrade that you're absolutely going to want, and on a bike like this, it really complements the whole overall feel. It's, again, just a really nice braking package with good performance. You've got good power through the pull. It's got one of those big cruiser type brake levers on it, so not the best feel at your finger, but when you get into the lever pull, really good power and good feedback, which is really important. And a nice, again, it's just something that I think you're gonna like on a performance cruiser. As a whole, I think this bike is just such a good example of how much fun you can have on a cruiser when you blend those worlds, right? You bring parts of the sport world and parts of the cruiser world, and I think the beauty is that Indian has really done a good job of finding that balance and not going too heavy one side or the other.
Okay, so let's take a look at the electronics package on the 101. Now, this bike only comes with what Indian refers to as the Limited Plus Tech Package. That's gonna get you things like cruise control, switchable traction control, a USB charging port, and keyless push button ignition. Now, on top of that, you get 3 riding modes. You get Sport, Standard, and Tour. Okay, we really like having those options, but in all honesty, we pretty much always ride this bike in Sport. The fueling through the mid-range is really good. It's just a little bit choppy off the bottom, but overall, Sport really gives you that power delivery that you want. You go down into Standard and it just feels a little too soft for city street riding or anything like that, and it loses kind of the aggressiveness, which is why you want a bike like this, let's be honest. Now, one of the cool things about getting the Limited Plus Tech Package on this bike is that you're getting Indian's 4-inch touchscreen display powered by Ride Command. Now, I've used this display on a couple of other Indian motorcycles, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant solution. How much information Indian is able to relay to you in such a small and clean display, I think it's just really good. It's a great piece of hardware. Now, on this bike, what I really like is that if you're really not into digital displays, I mean, in its base display format, it's just a really traditional looking tach and speedometer. Now you can click here on the touchscreen and you get even more information. Now what we can also do here is switch over to this screen and you can see how easy it is to adjust the electronic settings on this bike through the display. For instance there, we're gonna turn traction control off. What we're gonna do here is switch over from sport to standard mode. Boom, it's that simple. Now what we can also do here is go through our navigation. This thing has got really good navigation tools to it. All you do, plug in the address that you want, and it's got turn-by-turn option there for you. If you get out of the map, it'll show you the arrows, where you're supposed to turn, when you're supposed to turn. Overall, just a really nice system. Again, how well Indian is able to get that information relayed to you in such a small and clean display is just a nice touch. A couple other things, looking at the controls, it's a really nice modern control pod. The only thing we do wish, I think it should come on every bike, is backlit buttons. I mean, come on, little things like that would be nice. But overall, it's a really nice look, nice fit and finish to this, really quality pieces. I guess the one other thing I should say is Indian has struggled for a long time with the operating speeds of this system. It takes a little bit of time to get the thing fired up, but by the time you have the bike warmed up and getting ready to ride, it's usually ready to go. Other than that, a really nice system.
Okay, so we talk a lot about the performance on a bike like this, but let's be honest, so much about one of these machines is what does it make you feel like? How does it fit? Are the lines right? Does it have enough vibrations? Too many vibrations? Well, the answer on this bike is really basically great, yes, and okay, maybe there's a little bit of room for improvement because the exhaust note isn't quite what you would want it to be on a performance cruiser necessarily. Now, as I mentioned, I'm 6'3". This bike is considered a mid-size cruiser, so it's a little bit smaller dimensionally than the Sport Chief and the Lowrider S that we tested recently. But honestly, I'm actually pretty comfortable. I've done a couple 5-hour rides on this bike, and I get back at the end of that ride, and I don't feel like I've been folded up on the machine. You've got forward controls on this bike, which, I mean, okay, on a performance cruiser, maybe you'd expect them to be mid controls, but it opens up the rider triangle a bit, and it's a really comfortable bike to spend an extended period of time on. Also got to give credit to those 6-inch bar risers, get you up a little bit and keep you in that upright riding position. Overall, I think it's a really comfortable motorcycle. Maybe the one exception I will say is the seat. Yes, that nice stitch seat, it's a cool look, but it's not quite as supportive as I would want. Again, I'm maybe a little bit bigger than the average rider, so maybe not as big of an issue for the normal sized human beings, let's say. But otherwise, you know, that's really the only thing that I've found from an ergonomic standpoint that I would adjust on this bike. Otherwise, a really comfortable bike for just open road cruising. As for the new Speed Plus 1250 engine, I think the biggest takeaway for me is how much sportier this engine feels. I think I mentioned it earlier, but on the 101 Scout, you do have dedicated ECU tuning, which is about 5 or 6 horsepower more than what you're gonna get on the standard Scouts. And man, it really does make a difference. Again, one of the very interesting things about this engine is the tuning of it. It's a lot more mid-range and top-end focused. You don't have as much bottom-end grunt as you might expect from a big V-twin. Now, that is cool for what you're getting, right? I mean, this is a bike that wants to be revved out. It's a bike that wants to carry speed, and I think that in the right environment, you can really enjoy it. It's just a fun package overall. One thing I will say is that this bike has a lighter crankshaft than before. Now that's interesting because what that's done is it's kind of almost affected the bike negatively in the really slow speed riding, especially like if you're doing stoplight to stoplight type stuff in the city. It just doesn't have that quick pickup off of the bottom, so when you're leaving a stoplight, you gotta slip the clutch just a little bit more and give it a little bit more gas than you would expect, because again, it just doesn't have that real grunty V-twin like feel off the bottom, at the very bottom. Again, once you get into that mid-range and top end, it's a really happy free revving engine. It's just really interesting that the direction that Indian has gone with this platform. I think for the most part, that mid-range is what you're going to be after though, and I think so this engine does deliver there. I will also say that this bike does have a slip assist clutch for the first time this year. I don't necessarily love the feel from it, again, especially when you combine it with that lighter crankshaft and that kind of work you're having to do off of a stoplight, but it is a little bit lighter pull, which is nice, again, for a bunch of commuting type riding. Going back to the exhaust note, I will say it's a little bit more Taylor Swift than Rob Zombie, which is to say not all that intimidating. One cool thing about this new exhaust design is that it does help Indian to fit the saddlebags on the Scout. Now the 101 doesn't come standard with saddlebags, but it's the same muffler across the lineup, and basically not having the two mufflers gives Indian a little bit more room for the saddlebags to hang down. So if you did want to mount bags to this bike, theoretically you've got a little bit more room there. Now the muffler itself ain't exactly easy on the eyes either. It probably is the one thing I would want to swap out, again, just to get a little bit of better sound and looks from it. Another drawback to this engine is that the transmission just feels a little bit clunky and sloppy. You just don't have the really smooth, refined shift to it. And I guess the big thing there is that the rest of the engine feels so modern and refined, and you just don't fully get that from this transmission.
In many ways, that interweaving of raw and refined are what the 101 Scout is all about. Remember that thing Indian said about wanting to build a classic American V-twin cruiser with just a little bit of performance on top? Well, that is exactly what you get with this bike. Okay, performance is a little bit of a relative term, but with the upgraded suspension and brakes on this bike, you can have a lot of fun. And then at the same time, it's still a really comfortable, enjoyable, relaxed motorcycle for just cruising up the coast or down open back roads. I also love how the electronics are there, but don't try to be a star of the show. And then there's all of the little details throughout the bike, which are just that cherry on top. This is an absolutely gorgeous machine. I guess ironically, one of our issues with the bike is that it only comes in red or white with this special Indian graphic. I think there are a lot of people who are going to want the performance of the 101, but not that flashy up-spec paint that you could only get on this bike. Some single paint color options would be really nice. Our test bike was a little bit cold-blooded, but ran fine once it was up to temp. And then there's things like these cheap foot pegs, which just don't match the overall fit and finish of the bike. If this were our bike, we'd probably swap out the seat, the exhaust, and the foot pegs, but otherwise this thing checks off all of the right boxes that we'd wanted to. And in a lot of ways, it feels like the best executed performance cruiser out right now. Which is important because Indian is doing this in a space that is really important for future growth. And let's be honest, in a space that the Harley-Davidson Sportster S has kind of left a void in. If you are shopping in that space or interested in performance cruisers, you should definitely give the 101 Scout a look. It is an incredibly entertaining motorcycle that does an excellent job blending performance and cruiser worlds.